Thank you, Noura, so much for sitting with me here today. The honor and privilege is mine. I'm hoping to talk to you a little bit about the response of Western institutions to Palestinian solidarity and Palestinian liberation itself, and whether you think liberals today are doing more to facilitate or hinder such liberation. And I'm wondering, before we get into these three areas in earnest, we can start off with this question. So as we approach the 2-year mark of October 2023, how do you feel that the international response has been overall and since October 2023 to the ongoing genocide in Gaza?
I think that the response to the genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza over the past 2 years has taken on two fundamentally different faces. On the one hand, you have Western powers that have supported the genocide through the provision of arms, through the provision of diplomatic cover, through the provision of impunity to Israel in order to facilitate and continue its genocide. On the other hand, you have a groundswell of popular movement globally that, despite the tremendous amount of propaganda, of risk, of threats, have risen up to insist that not only must it stop, but understanding full well that what's happening to the Palestinians is also an assault on them, because it's an assault on their humanity. It's going after their basic precepts of what connects them as humans in the form of empathy, when they are told repeatedly that any empathy that they have for Palestinians, be it women, children, men, adults, young people, all of it is tantamount to some sort of empathy with an evil, and empathy with something that's a risk to the rest of the world. And I think that affront has woken up many people, right? Yes. To understand what is it about this, where they're trying to gaslight. They want me to gaslight myself and negate what I see in order to make much broader claims. And so we see this duality of, frankly, Western state violence, which is a continuation, I think, of a lot of what many Western states themselves have been forged, together with a groundswell and a radical shift amongst millions and millions of people who are understanding this for what it is, as a racial and colonial genocide of a native people.
Right. As a lawyer, perhaps you can speak to this. Do you feel that the statehood recognition that's happening right now has promise legally or otherwise?
So the recognition bid that's happened at the United Nations 80th session, right, 80th Assembly, is, we need to understand that as not having much import at all. Number one, these states are latecomers. Some, 148 states already recognize Palestine. It obtained a non-voting member status at the United Nations in 2012. It's been able to accede to human rights treaties, to participate at the United Nations. It's been able to participate in different multilateral fora because of the status that it's gained. So these states, Western states mostly, number one, are latecomers. Number two, what they're doing is less than symbolism, and it might actually cause harm, because at this point, several of these states are complicit in the ongoing genocide of Palestinians through the provision of arms, as well as in violation of their legal obligations to not recognize the unlawful presence of Israel in the territory, and to prevent genocide per the ICJ decision January 2024. And by preventing genocides, meaning imposing an arms embargo. They're evading those legal responsibilities and instead giving us, a recognition. And if you look into it, the recognition itself, if you look at the New York Declaration, which provides the outlines for what it looks like, the recognition places conditions on the Palestinians. Conditions of what their state looks like, that it would be demilitarized, who can be in the government, first and foremost, saying that Hamas has no role to play, and then placing zero conditions on Israel, zero conditions of who can be in their government, of de-Zionification, which is necessary in this moment, of reparations for what happened to Palestinians, accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity. There is no mention of genocide. And so you get out of this in the document itself that this actually might be a way for these Western states to appease their base, are the millions rising, at the same time to absolve themselves of responsibility for the ongoing genocide and Israel's settler colonial expansion, while also to normalize genocide and continue to frame Palestinians as the problem that either need to be destroyed, as the US and Israel believe, or need to be encaged, as several of these states believe according to the New York Declaration.
You present this so well and thoroughly. I'm just wondering whether you think that what you described falls under the weaponization of international law, because you've written on this. Is that the case? Is that too much a stretch to say, or?
I don't know that I would describe this as the weaponization of international law, because frankly, they're not going to law, they're evading law.
Okay.
Right?
Right.
Because have they pivoted to the law, we would have gone to the Genocide Convention first. We would have gone to the laws of war, the Fourth Geneva Convention. We would have gone to the customary laws of war on regulating combat between a state belligerent and a nascent sovereign or non-state actors, as in the case of Hamas, right? There are many realms of law to have gone to. They don't pull on any of them. They're drawing on politics. They continue to do the work of what the United States has done, which is to remove Palestine from the international sphere and multilateral resolution, right? And to put it into a political framework where it should be resolved through negotiations. But the negotiations, as they've been dictated since 1993 under the Oslo framework, have been bilateral negotiations between Israel, a nuclear power, the 8th most significant weapons exporter in the world, against Palestinians, who are a stateless people without an airport, whose so-called president needs permission from Israel to travel, overseen by global superpower, which explains that it is the unequivocal proviso of arms, finances, and impunity to Israel. And so we've seen these states actually evade law and legal obligation to continue to put us in a framework where power dictates, and that power is severely imbalanced against the Palestinians. And yet we have alternatives. We have alternatives. We have what grassroots is demanding in the form of accountability. And we have bits of that's embodied by the Hague Group, the group of the Global South co-chaired by South Africa and Colombia, which have done the most to advance actually a different approach, which South Africa brought the case against Israel for genocide, but Colombia has also cut, for example, its coal exports to Israel. And they're demanding a full and complete arms embargo, an ending of diplomatic ties, an ending of trade. That's more of what we need in this moment.
Yes. I'm wondering, you speak about the Western countries that are, for example, continuing to export weapons. And you're also seeing at the same time Western institutions, universities, they're repressing or they're attempting to undermine any show of Palestinian solidarity and wrongly or always punishing it where they see it on campus and so forth. So I'm wondering if you see there being some kind of, how do I put it, some kind of collaboration between states and Western institutions working sort of in tandem to basically nullify the possibility of Palestinian liberation.
So let me take a step back here. And I think, there's a framing issue that might help us. Sure. And that issue is one which has centered the establishment of a Jewish demographic majority on Palestinian land in order to, have a state, right? As the primary concern, as the primary priority. Insofar as you're centering Zionism in this framework, which in and of itself is problematic as established by the General Assembly in 1975 in Resolution 3379, declaring Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination. Insofar as you center that, Palestinians now not only become secondary, but their inferiority vis-a-vis Jewish nationals or Zionist settler sovereigns becomes entrenched. We have entrenched the superiority of Jewish nationals as inscribed in Israeli law vis-a-vis all other Palestinians and accepted that as a given. So immediately equality is out the window. In addition to that, we're then making the concerns of Palestinians secondary. That whether or not they can thrive, they can live, they can, build their families, they can forge their futures, is all contingent on achieving the first priority.
Yeah.
And they can be a secondary concern. So the outcome of that entrenched thinking, which even this moment hasn't shifted, right? But it should shift. But even this moment hasn't shifted, has been that rather than targeting the systems of oppression that are the root sources of violence and instability and a lack of the peace and justice that everybody wants, rather than attack prolonged military occupation, apartheid, and genocide, and racial colonial ideologies. Mm-hmm. Instead of attacking those, we're attacking Palestinians as the problem. Mm. We make Palestinians the problem as opposed to the systems as the problem. And so now we're concerned, what do we do with the Palestinians? And again, as we've seen, the U.S. and Israel has basically said, get rid of them through destruction and ethnic cleansing. And those that are supposed allies are saying, let's find a way to contain them that would most appease Israel and maintain that first priority. Yes. What happens when we actually shift from that framework and center Palestinians?
Right.
To most people, that's blasphemy. How could we? Because the dehumanization of Palestinians is so deep and so thorough. It's almost unimaginable. But in that moment that we can imagine Palestinians as centered is when we get to other visions of liberation, most of which have been presented by Palestinians. Palestinians, for over a century, have proposed coexistence, have proposed living together, have said, Jews are part of this land. This is the history. Ahad Tamimi brilliantly said, that if Jews have a history in this land, then it's my history as a Palestinian. It's not separate from it, right? There's so many possibilities that open up when we displace that first priority of establishing a ethno-national state marked by a Jewish demographic majority in the place of a people that already exist and have a right to self-determination and belonging.
Yes. And you mentioned containment a moment ago. And I also find that being part of the complicity, was staggering about it, for me at least, is that it's not just the right. It's liberals.
Oh, yeah.
How is this possible? Should I be surprised? Or is this part of empire? Like, this is really, because, not long before October 2023, we saw lots of efforts among universities to decolonize the university, for example. But now, it's the polar opposite. And a lot of these universities, executive.
Yeah. So here I just want to emphasize, I think that so much of the concern around universities under the Trump administration has been featured as the coercion, right, that Trump has placed, the threats. We'll withdraw your federal funding unless you do X, Y, and Z, on your universities, all under the name of anti-Semitism, which is very, very much weaponized. Yeah. But I want to emphasize that even without those threats, these universities were part and parcel of squashing Palestinian protests on their campuses and squashing their allies. And, now we have to ask, why were the universities doing that? You're framing it as, is it liberal? Well, I'm going to frame it as a broader issue that happens to do with the university, which is where we see the university increasingly enter a very neoliberal model of governance, that rather than be governed by faculty, in a democratic approach, rather than be publicly subsidized, right? That instead, especially U.S. universities, what you see is that boards of trustees that oversee endowments are increasingly venture capitalists and hedge fund managers that have nothing necessarily to do with knowledge production and a commitment to academic freedom. For them, it's a bottom line. For them, this is a business. For them, their students are the customers. For them, the faculty are beholden to those customers rather than to be committed to this knowledge production. And in that moment, we see, because of an already pre-existing crisis, we see that the weakest link, right, is that many of these board of trustees actually oppose Palestinian liberation. Many are self-identified Zionists. We know that at the University of Pennsylvania, that one of the trustees, their spouse is the treasurer on a family foundation that donated $100 million to Canary Mission, which basically doxes students. So we see that the board of the makeup of these trustees is also the source of harm to their own students. And so here I encourage us to think about, what are these models for the university? Yes. That Palestine is certainly a crisis point, and the attack on students is certainly a crisis point, but that we're seeing a broader unraveling where academic freedom is subverted to other priorities in terms of fundraising, in terms of, generating, revenue and income, as opposed to, being the last bastion of independent thought, of academic freedom, right? Students are normally at the front line of tremendous radical social change because they're taking risks. They are agents of change. And here we're attempting to squash that in a way that sets a horrible precedent for the future and all other emancipatory struggles that we believe in.
Yes, speaking of emancipatory struggles, I feel I can ask you this, just to be frank, as a man, I've never really felt it my place to give a robust explanation as to why this is happening. But yourself, being a Palestinian and a woman, and of course, someone of great knowledge and depth, I'm wondering if you can comment on why there is this relative silence among Western liberals when it comes to the plight of Palestinian women, but not women in the West.
Oh, no. Liberal feminists, Western feminists care about the plight of Palestinian women, but only when it happens at the hands of their own men. Mm. So they're quick to want to talk about domestic violence, forced veiling, right, femicide, all of which are real concerns, but they will not recognize the structural violence that impacts the lives of Palestinian women who have told us many, many times over that the greatest harm to their lives is Israeli settler colonization that marks them as removable, not necessarily patriarchy in the community, which is of concern and is being combated. Yes. They want to be able to save themselves. Yes. And to save ourselves, we need no harm done. And that means removing the conditions of oppression that are provided by the West in the provision of arms and impunity to Israel that make it impossible to be able to advocate more robustly. Right. So what then explains that inability to identify structural violence, that inability to see that when bombs are being dropped, they don't distinguish between women? What makes that impossible for them to understand that when these bombs contaminate the earth, that future generations are going to be affected, that in the course of genocide, what's being targeted is the possibility of women to be able to have their reproductive rights, to produce a future? That inability, frankly, is only explicable through a racist framework. I tell my students all the time that sometimes when there's this big gap that makes no logical sense, you can insert a racist logic. That helps it make sense. Yes. That for them, there's an inferiority. That Palestinian women, for example, haven't defined their liberation in the image of the West, right? And so that makes it so that they can't see themselves in this model. Right. For them, it might be an individual model of, just my body, kind of my choice, which I don't disagree with, but that obscures the collective struggle of women in other societies. And I think that the fundamental basis of any feminist practice and proxies must be a belief and a commitment to allow women, wherever they are, to define their own liberation.
Right. Yes, I think that's really well put. Because, there seems, among just Western liberals in general, I'm noticing this more, especially since October 2023, and I've just been scrutinizing things more, that there's like a meddling. Liberals, they kind of like to meddle sometimes. And I do think it's deliberate as an attempt to kind of undermine these collective self-determination movements, because it's not in their image, right? It's like, we want you to conform to how we see liberation. Your voice is unimportant.
Well, I just to be fair, right, to the to the liberals, I think they're consistent. I think we see the worst of it in the case of Palestine because we're watching a genocide for almost 2 years and we're seeing their outright complicity in it. And so it makes it so glaring. But I don't think that liberals were much better when it comes to Black liberation. Like that continues, or when it comes to indigenous liberation, you know, in North America or Australia or otherwise, there continues to be a desire to also name how they will liberate themselves, right? That what it should look like and how they should, you know, behave. So, you know, there's this co-optation almost of Black Lives Matter without really engaging, well, what does Black liberation mean? In the United States, for example, when there has been a critique of police institutions and prison institutions as sites of racial control of an entire class, right? How are we not engaging that this isn't just about reforming a system that disproportionately harms Black communities, but actually a system that's been embedded into all of our institutions, our educational institutions, our policing institutions, our banking institutions, our real estate institutions, our financial institutions. What is it about this model that we have incorporated? That work to actually scrutinize these things is the work of decolonization, is the work to examine how has this country's, you know, institutions been established in a way that is predicated on the subjugation of another people. And that's the hard work. That's the hard work, be it for Black liberation, indigenous peoples, and Palestinians, is the work of not just, you know, allowing us to be equal with those in power, but actually to rearrange those models of power that include us in its image.
Absolutely. That's where I think the revolutionary potential is.
I think so. And what's really, really inspiring in this moment is how much Palestinians are actually illuminating that for the world.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly this moment has got me really to see that there is actually colonial logic in Western liberalism. I was like, can't believe it. I didn't notice because, you know, for a while, I would say even in the 2010s, there was a lot. I even mentioned this when Norman Fink was saying about the, you know, the social justice that I was reading about in like establishment papers. I was thinking like, is this a new is this a shift in our culture finally? People are concerned about liberation, but this moment is revealing that like it's still unfortunately a lot to do with containment. It's about our way. Then you have, I mean, that's where a whole other discussion, the nonprofits, pacifying movements, preventing robust self-determination. I want to ask you before we wrap up, Noura, about, you know, we've talked a little bit about the longevity, you know, of Palestinian solidarity movements in North America. You've seen it sometimes stronger than at other times. And I'm wondering whether you can comment on what you see the potential for longevity is now with the current Palestinian solidarity movement in North America, and what is maybe necessary to sustain that long term. No, you know, so often when I personally, I'm so, you know, I fall into despair. It's impossible not to. It's impossible not to when we see these images and the just the amount of atrocity that we've seen that hasn't been enough to be the final straw. Right? What will it take for it to be the final straw? And that you can't help but fall into some despair. And what's lifted me up out of that is remembering that I am continuing a legacy that my ancestors have forged. And that there are future generations that will continue a legacy after us. And that freedom, right? Freedom isn't a destination. It's a practice. And it's a commitment to how we live and what we live for and who we live for in this moment, right? It's the belief and the reminder to ourselves that surrender will not make us safer. That somehow if you make it and just get by, that's not an option for us, right? Because that's actually emboldening those who are trying to squash us. And so the Palestinian movement, especially, you know, I can comment on it in North America.
has gone through ebbs and flows. And, I personally participated in one of its heights at the start of what's known as the Second Intifada, when we launched, right, divestment from apartheid Israel at the collapse of, the peace process in the early 2000s. And we saw the proliferation of BDS movements. And during this time, we see a number of dynamics take place, right? We see BDS being launched. We also see later what's known as the Ferguson Gaza moment that precipitates an analytical return to Black Palestinian solidarity. We also see in this moment campaigns that have been able to connect Trump and Netanyahu as being bad actors during Trump's first administration. So we see a movement that has continuously moved forward as a result of these dynamics. And simultaneously, we've seen the Israeli government move increasingly to the right. Torpedo the Palestinian state or any possibility of it immediately, but go far more right than that to basically, do in the words of Smotrich, which is to give Palestinian three choices, as he did in his radical proposal in 2017. Palestinians can live as supplicants, they can leave, they can die. And then in 2018, you get the nation state law, which basically says that the only people with the right to self-determination between the Mediterranean Sea and the River Jordan are Jewish nationals, declaring themselves an apartheid state all out. And so these dynamics, this both, the growth of grassroots movement together with the rightward, increasingly rightward shift of Israel, making their objectives known, making their horizon clear, right? Most evident in genocide, right? I think has shaped the way that the Palestinian movement has been able to respond. We see an unprecedented height in 2021 during the Unity Intifada.
Right.
And we've seen, I think now in my lifetime, an unprecedented attack on Palestinian movement, and specifically at a moment when the pro-Palestinian movement, and I just want to call it a liberation, emancipatory movement, human rights movement, right? When we see this movement grow despite all odds, despite the propaganda, despite the risks and the threats, this is now we're seeing the full weight of federal government come down to shut down, right? Not to shut down Palestinian movement, but to do it by taking away everybody's rights. Right? That if you're not going to have freedom of speech to speak on Palestine, that freedom of speech is going to be taken away from everybody. And we saw that, right, recently in the Jimmy Kimmel FCC episode. If universities are not going to allow their students to protest, universities are going to be beholden to their funders and to where the money comes from, and not be accountable to anybody, right? If you cannot reach for the law to defend Palestinians, the rights to live and to thrive and to survive, not only will it be shut down for them, but all international legal institutions will be decimated. We see international law being disemboweled. Same thing when it comes to journalism. Journalists internally have revolted against their own media corporations because of their censorship, words they can use and can't use, how much they can say, about whom do they humanize. So we see that the cost of squashing the movement for liberation for Palestinians and, frankly, for everybody, right, comes at the cost of squashing these institutions and these means for everybody as well. So it's why you may hear Palestinians say, right, free Palestine and Palestine will free us all. Yes. Because it's really this commitment. It's really this thread that goes through. And if we understand this, we can understand these other systems as well.
Yes, no, you allude to it really well, I think. It's like an attack or a war on our shared humanity. Like
full stop.
An attack on our conscience, an attack on our rational thinking, our ability to formulate thoughts, to organize. It's like they want to...
None.
Yeah.
You cannot be empathetic. Right. If you're empathetic, you sympathize with terrorism. I mean, this part.
Right.
And empathy is the thing that actually makes us human. Right? I've seen it in a place where if you feel pain, that's how you know you're alive. Yeah. But if I can feel your pain, that's how I know I'm human. And that is under attack.
Yes.
Outright. But like you said, our rational thinking is under attack. Our own, what our eyes see is under attack. Our conscience is under attack. But imagine if they're able to successfully bully us into that compliance, the strength that our political and economic elite will have to do anything they want with us.
Yes. No, it's absolutely frightening. Thankfully, there is an awakening happening. Noura, thank you so much for this profoundly illuminating conversation. I'm just wondering if at all anything that you like to say as a final observation or thoughts.
I just want to say that really in our lifetime, as much as we've insisted that Palestinians are human like everyone else, in my, watching Palestinians in Gaza, I wondered if they're not superhuman to be able to have endured so much despite our collusion against them and our failure to stop the genocide. I am so profoundly sorry to our kin and to everybody that we don't have what it takes to stop this. And my deep hope is that we have planted enough seeds that through this fire, humanity will survive.
Yes, I hope as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.